Have you ever wondered why some voices that once roared with fire are later reduced to a whisper, muted by the very system that once praised them? Some names fade not because they lack power, but because their truth was too raw, too defiant, too real for an industry built on illusion. Boss, born Lichelle Laws, was one of those voices. A woman who walked into the male-dominated world of 90s hip-hop not asking for permission, but demanding space. Her name wasn't just a title, it was a warning, a declaration that she wasn't there to play by anyone's rules. But history has a cruel way of rewriting women like her, especially when they come from the wrong side of comfort, wielding both power and pain like weapons. In the early 90s, when rap was still wrestling with its own identity, torn between authenticity and commercial hunger, Boss exploded onto the scene like a thunderclap from Detroit's underground. Her voice, heavy with smoke and fury, cut through the airwaves with Born Gangstas, an album that didn't just speak about the streets, it embodied them. But what most people didn't see was the storm brewing behind that persona, the layers of pressure and manipulation that turned a real story into a staged mythology. You see, the industry loved the idea of a female gangsta, just not the reality of one. It loved the aesthetic, the danger, the sellable rebellion. But a black woman who was truly fearless, that was different. That was threatening. So when Boss arrived, the machine went to work, turning her raw truth into a product, wrapping her lived experience in marketing gloss until even her pain became performative. They wanted her voice, not her autonomy, her image, not her integrity. But beneath that hardened persona, Lichelle was carrying something much heavier than her lyrics revealed. Poverty, trauma, displacement, the invisible weight that so many black women have carried while being told to smile, perform, and stay strong. She wasn't just fighting the system, she was fighting for her own sense of self within it. And when the curtain began to fall, it wasn't just her career that broke. It was the illusion of what it meant to be real in an industry built on control. There's something deeply tragic about watching authenticity get commodified, watching truth become costume. And that's what happened to Boss. She became both the symbol and the victim of a culture that celebrates rebellion, but punishes the rebel once she stops entertaining. You can almost feel the irony, how the same voice that once represented resistance was later silenced by the very forces she spoke against. The first dark truth the world refuses to accept is that Boss wasn't destroyed by failure. She was undone by success. Because in hip-hop, especially in that era, the moment you climb too high, someone always decides how far you're allowed to go. When a man spits anger, it's called power. When a woman does, it's called attitude. And when a black woman refuses to play submissive, it becomes career suicide. Lichelle Laws paid that price. Behind the tough exterior was a woman who'd been shaped by survival, by nights without electricity, by a mother who fought for her children with everything she had, by a city that demanded strength just to exist. She didn't invent her story, she lived it. But in the eyes of executives who couldn't reconcile the person with the persona, Boss became a brand before she was allowed to be a human being. And then came the collapse. The same magazines that once praised her edge began whispering that she was a fraud. The rumor, crafted, seeded, and spread, claimed that her gangsta persona wasn't real, that she was posing. But that lie was convenient, wasn't it? It made her downfall easier to digest. Because to acknowledge that Boss was both artist and victim meant confronting the uncomfortable truth about how the industry uses black pain as currency. The machine can't sell your story if it admits it helped break you. As time passed, her name slipped into the shadows of hip-hop history, mentioned in footnotes, not in legacy lists. But those who remember the energy, that raw defiance, that fire that couldn't be contained. And maybe that's why her story still matters. Because every time someone like Boss disappears, a piece of truth vanishes with them. A truth about what happens when a woman tries to own her story in a world that prefers her silent. The world saw Boss as a gangsta, but behind that label was a poet of survival, a chronicler of injustice, a woman who tried to turn pain into poetry, and when that became too dangerous, too inconvenient, they erased her. Not because she was forgotten, but because she was remembered too vividly. The second dark truth the world refuses to accept is that Boss's erasure wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. You see, when the industry realized it couldn't control her, it didn't just walk away. It rewrote her. It crafted a softer, neater version of history where women like Lichelle Laws were either cautionary tales or distant echoes. And when she began to fade from the charts, they didn't ask why. They simply moved on, as if she had never mattered. But you can't erase an energy like that. You can only bury it. And buried things have a way of resurfacing when the world is finally ready to face its own hypocrisy. To understand what happened to Boss, you have to see her not as a fallen artist, but as a mirror reflecting the contradictions of her time. She rose during an era when authenticity was currency, yet authenticity was precisely what the machine sought to control. Labels demanded rawness, but punished truth. They wanted the fire of the streets without the smoke that came with it. They wanted rebellion, but only if it could be sold in glossy packaging. Boss was too much of everything, too fierce, too proud, too real. Her lyrics weren't fiction, they were confession. Her energy wasn't staged, it was survival made audible. But in an industry where the spectacle mattered more than the soul, her rawness became a liability. The executives wanted a performance. Boss gave them a revolution. And so came the subtle sabotage, the kind that doesn't make headlines but kills legacies all the same. No promotion, no tour support, no second chances. When she spoke out about the exploitation, the gatekeepers closed their doors quietly. When she tried to pivot, they whispered that she was difficult, unmarketable. The classic script reserved for women who refused to be compliant. The tragedy of Boss wasn't that she failed, it's that she succeeded too loudly in a world that only tolerates a woman's success when it fits into its comfort zones. She was supposed to be a figurehead, not a force. But forces have a way of disrupting order, and Lachelle's presence was a disruption to every norm the system upheld. Think about it. How often are women in hip-hop allowed to be angry without consequence? To be dominant without being demonized? To speak from pain without being turned into an archetype of tragedy? Boss represented a kind of power that frightened those who profited from imitation, but not from truth. Because the truth about being a black woman in hip-hop, especially in the early 90s, is that you were expected to perform toughness while never challenging the hand that feeds you. The second you start questioning the table, they take away your seat. Lichelle Laws refused to sit quietly. Even after the lights dimmed, she stayed rooted in her purpose. Speaking at community events, mentoring, surviving in silence while the world she helped build pretended not to see her. She once said in an interview, long after her commercial peak, that she felt like the industry only loved the illusion of her. That sentence carries the weight of every artist who has ever been consumed by their creation. But here's the cruelest twist. When she was later found struggling years after her fame trying to raise money for a medical condition that had drained her physically and financially, the media suddenly remembered her. Not to celebrate her art, but to feast on the spectacle of her suffering. That's how the system works, doesn't it? It devours you in your prime and then resurrects your pain for clicks when you're gone. The same cameras that ignored her legacy turned back to capture her fragility. Because nothing sells like tragedy, especially the kind dressed in nostalgia. You might want to look away, but you can't. Because somewhere deep down, you recognize the pattern. The way society builds up black women as icons only to dismantle them the moment they stop being convenient. It's not just a story about one artist. It's the anatomy of betrayal. Boss didn't just face a music industry. She faced an entire cultural system that demanded her strength but punished her humanity. When she was powerful, they called her too masculine. When she showed vulnerability, they called her weak. There was no winning, only survival, and even survival came at a cost. But despite the silence, despite the manipulation, her influence never vanished. Every modern woman in hip-hop who walks into a room with her chin up and her voice unfiltered carries a piece of what Boss fought for. She carved out a blueprint for resistance without even realizing it. Her story isn't about defeat, it's about endurance. And maybe that's the part the world refuses to accept most of all, that the woman they buried in silence was never gone. She just learned to exist outside the system that couldn't contain her. The third dark truth about Boss, and perhaps the most haunting, is that the betrayal didn't just come from the industry. It came from the culture she helped build. The same streets that once celebrated her, the same community that crowned her the realest female MC alive, slowly turned its gaze elsewhere. Fame has a way of warping loyalty. When the lights shift, so do her allegiances. There's a cruel irony in watching an artist who once embodied rebellion be punished for living it. The public loves the myth of resistance, but rarely the messiness of real struggle. Boss's story was never about spectacle, it was about survival. And survival isn't glamorous. It's lonely, unfiltered, often invisible. When Lichelle Laws fell ill years later, battling kidney disease, facing eviction, fundraising just to stay alive, the world reacted not with empathy, but confusion. How could someone so powerful fall so far? But that question misses the truth. She didn't fall. The world simply stopped looking. Her voice, her fire, her existence didn't vanish. It was erased by the selective memory of a culture that treats pain as disposable. Boss's silence in those later years wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a truth too heavy to share. Because what do you do when the system that claimed to love your art is the same one that commodified your pain? What do you do when the fans who once screamed your lyrics now scroll past your struggles, numb to the human being beneath the legend? For Black women in hip-hop, this is an ancient story. They are celebrated when fierce, forgotten when fragile. Boss was one of the first to live that paradox so publicly. Her strength was both her shield and her undoing, because the world doesn't know what to do with a woman who refuses to conform, especially one whose rage is righteous, whose confidence isn't performative, whose truth cuts deeper than entertainment. In many ways, Boss became a casualty of the very power she wielded. The industry turned her into an image, then discarded the woman behind it. And yet, even in silence, she never surrendered her authenticity. When she spoke, even in her final interviews, her words carried the same fire, tempered by time but not diminished. She spoke about love, about purpose, about faith. But beneath it all was that quiet ache, the feeling of being forgotten by a world she helped shape. There's something profoundly tragic in that, to be the spark that lit the path for others, only to walk in darkness alone. Yet that's what makes her story so powerful, because it forces us to ask, how many artists have we left behind in our obsession with the next? How many women have we admired for their defiance, only to abandon when that defiance no longer entertains us? Her legacy isn't just musical, it's moral. It's a warning about what happens when a culture mistakes resilience for invincibility. When you see a woman like Boss, fierce, articulate, unbreakable, you assume she can't be hurt. You assume she doesn't need help. And in that assumption, we become complicit in her silence. In the grand mythology of hip-hop, the story of Boss is both familiar and singular. She was the rebel who refused to bow, the queen who refused to conform, the truth-teller who refused to lie. But behind that armor was a human being, vulnerable, spiritual, complex. That's the part people forget. She wasn't just rapping, she was testifying. Each lyric was a piece of her soul, a declaration that she existed beyond stereotype, beyond gender, beyond control. Yet the machine doesn't value humanity, it values headlines. And when Boss could no longer deliver the spectacle, they stopped writing her story. The industry moved on, but history doesn't forget. Even in the quiet, her presence lingers. You can feel it in the cadence of modern rappers who channel her confidence, in the defiant tone of artists who refuse to compromise their truth. Whether they know it or not, they are her descendants. And so, the fourth truth reveals itself not in tragedy, but in transcendence. That even forgotten voices leave echoes too powerful to silence. Boss may have been written out of the mainstream narrative, but her energy lives on in the undercurrent of every woman who dares to speak unapologetically. There's a beauty in that kind of legacy, a haunting beauty, because true influence doesn't always come with fame or fortune. Sometimes it's born in the shadows, whispered from one generation to the next. Lichelle Laws didn't just make music, she made memory. And memory, no matter how long suppressed, has a way of demanding resurrection. The fifth and final dark truth about Boss is perhaps the hardest to face, not because it exposes her flaws, but because it exposes ours. The truth is that the world never truly knew what to do with a woman like her. Too loud to be invisible, too fearless to be controlled, too authentic to be marketed. She was the embodiment of everything the industry claims to celebrate: power, independence, vision, and yet she was punished for living it without apology. In her lifetime, Lichelle Laws became both a symbol and a mirror, the symbol of what female rappers could be: unfiltered, dangerous, brilliant, and the mirror reflecting a culture uncomfortable with that power. Society demands strength from Black women, but punishes them the moment that strength disrupts the comfort of others. Boss was a storm that refused to calm itself for the sake of politeness, and for that, she was branded as difficult, aggressive, unstable, all the labels used to cage those who dare to break free. But when you strip away the industry's noise, when you look past the interviews, the forgotten records, the whispered regrets, what remains is a woman who lived with terrifying clarity. Boss understood early on that fame is not salvation, it's a transaction. You trade your voice for visibility, your identity for image, your truth for survival. And when you stop performing, the machine moves on, leaving you to piece together the fragments of who you once were. Yet even in that loneliness, she remained defiant. Even when sick, broke, and overlooked, she refused to let the world rewrite her story. There was dignity in her struggle, a kind of spiritual royalty that fame could never grant nor strip away. When fans rediscovered her music years later, when they watched clips of her on stage, commanding with that sharp gaze and unbreakable tone, they saw not a fallen star, but a truth teller who'd been ahead of her time. They began to realize that Boss wasn't destroyed by the industry. She simply outgrew it. Because what do you do when your art is too real for the system that profits from illusion? What do you do when your existence challenges every boundary they've drawn around what a Black woman should be? You survive. And in surviving, you become legend. The industry stayed silent about her because silence is control. If they acknowledged her suffering, they'd have to confront their own exploitation. If they honored her influence, they'd have to admit how many others they buried alive beneath contracts, lies, and silence. So they pretended she was gone. But ghosts like Boss don't disappear. They haunt the very structures that tried to erase them. Her death didn't end her story, it solidified it. The woman who once stood as a rebel in hip-hop now stands as a lesson carved into its soul, that art without integrity is empty, and success without self is death in disguise. The world didn't deserve her, but it needed her, because she showed us that truth, even when ignored, never stops echoing. And maybe that's the final secret she took with her, that liberation doesn't come from fame or wealth or recognition. It comes from refusing to be anything less than who you are. She was never just a rapper. She was a revolution in motion, a reminder that every verse, every breath, every act of defiance was a form of prayer. Even now, you can hear her voice if you listen closely. It's in the spaces between beats, in the cadence of women who refuse to shrink, in the anger that fuels art with meaning. She lives in every woman who turns her pain into poetry, every artist who chooses truth over approval, every soul who refuses to apologize for existing loudly in a world that demands silence. Her story is no longer just about the betrayal of the industry. It's about resilience, the kind that can't be bought, packaged, or erased. Because despite everything she endured, Boss never surrendered her spirit. And that is the rarest kind of victory, to remain whole when the world profits from your breaking. When you think of Boss now, don't think of tragedy. Think of legacy. Think of the young girl from Detroit who turned her fury into rhythm, her struggle into scripture. Think of the way she made you feel the first time you heard her voice. That fire, that authority, that unapologetic truth. That was never just music. That was prophecy. And though the industry stayed silent, history won't, because the truth has a way of outliving the noise. Legends like Boss aren't meant to fade quietly. They exist to remind us that art isn't entertainment, it's survival. And sometimes survival is the loudest rebellion of all. Legends may fall, but their truth always rises.